Thank you, John, for that kind introduction. And thank you for the Manchester Historical Society to extend to me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And secondly, I'd like to thank each of you for coming, and I would hope that each of you in the audience tonight will leave having gained a better sense of what it has been for somebody, aka me, to have grown up on and experienced life on Baker's Island during the past 69 years. The picture on the screen right now is a picture of my mother on the Baker's Island Pier, probably about around the mid to 1930s. I was born on June 22nd, 1948. I was not conceived on Baker's Island, as my sister almost certainly was. However, I was first on Baker's Island on the 4th of July weekend following my birth. My sister had been already going to Baker's Island for 5 years. Sibling rivalry aside, we continued vacationing as a family at the island, sometimes visiting our family friends at the Collins cottage. This is Homer Collins, who was my father's best friend. His wife, Phyllis, that was an island as a result of an island romance, their marriage. And their son, Bruce, who was born a year before I was. So that picture was taken in 1947. That's at the Collins cottage, and the cottage in the background is the cottage that we currently own. Sometimes we rented cottages for varying amounts of time, various years, when cottages were available through the 50s and early 60s. And this is a picture of us, Bruce Collins on the right, me in the middle, and my sister playing in the backyard of the Collins cottage in, I'm guessing, 1952, 3. During that period of time, we stayed in or rented 7 different cottages. That's the Collins' cottage, and in the far right corner, you see the corner of our porch, and you see the lighthouse through our porch. The next slide is the Quonset hut on the backside of the island, and you haven't lived until you've stayed in a Quonset hut during a violent hailstorm. We stayed there for 1 weekend between renting other cottages, and there was a hailstorm that, just whitened the ground. It was a din inside. It's another cottage we rented. Again, another one that was owned by the same person as the next cottage was owned by. And the next cottage we rented, that cottage is in front of ours, west of ours. We didn't rent that very much, and that's our cottage in a much earlier time. That picture is probably, it could even be in the 1920s or 30s. So the island is a natural haven for dogs to roam. There have been dozens of island dogs who became island fixtures, and many who have been characters of note in their own right. The first two that I was aware of were Dusty and Smokey. Dusty belonged to the Collins family, who were my family's best friends. Dusty was a large dog that reasonably looked as though he'd been covered with charcoal dust. Dusty's sibling was Smokey, who also was on the island. This picture is of Dusty on the beach, and the Collins' son, Brett. The reason I say Brett is because Brett was Bruce and Barbara's son that looked exactly the same as Bruce when he was that age. So that's Bruce Collins and Dusty on the beach. And go back to the previous slide, please. And, getting back to the sibling rivalry, the picture on the screen is my sister hugging Smokey. When anyone sang on top of old Smokey, anywhere near Smokey, he would oblige by howling. Whenever Dusty and Smokey got anywhere near each other, and I mean any time and whenever they got anywhere near each other, there was sure to be a dogfight that sounded like it was going to end in one of the dogs' death, at least. Dogs that we have had at our cottage that was Onyx and Esker. We don't have a picture of Esker, but then this is Feldspar and Moses, and then the dogs that we have today are Paw-ing with a Boston accent, Paw-in without a G with apostrophe, and Bluster. Bluster's name is actually Bluster Brown Luster, or B.B. Luster, and he comes to anything. And then all these dogs have had relatively long lives and have become more or less island fixtures. Most of the ones that have passed on are buried under the apple tree on our property. And the next slide is a couple of island dogs of note, Amber and Boggs. He was dressed up for a dog show at the hall. He was a true character. Feldspar decided on his own and with no encouragement that various contraptions used to convey people around the island were fun for him to hitch a ride on. He would jump on people's trailers while they were moving and ride for a while. He would also decide to ride with people on their golf carts. And 2 or 3 times he even jumped into my empty wheelbarrow. I was pushing it up to my cottage. Many children on the island would come to our cottage just to see our dogs. They didn't care about us. You were probably saying to yourself at this moment that you didn't come out here tonight to see a picture gallery of dogs. To which I might respond to you by saying that probably is true. No doubt you are here because you are curious as to what does happen on Baker's Island anyway. And you might be sorry to hear when I say that largely what happens on Baker's Island is the same as what happens on shore. Except it feels different. After I go sailing for a time with my friend on his 40-foot sailboat, that's not the exact sailboat, but the same sailboat, people often ask me what we do on our sail. My response is usually something like this, that we sail, we eat, we drink, and fix the boat, and of course sleep. One winter, my friend Ned lived aboard his boat at Beverly Cove Marina. Feldspar and I had spent several nights aboard during his winter stay. Ned was one of Feldspar's favorite guests. When Ned left the marina for the summer season and was coming out to Baker's for overnight, I decided to meet Ned in my Zodiac on his trip out the harbor. course, feldspar came along, and as we came alongside the sailboat, which was underway, feldspar became excited to see Ned. We came alongside the pilot boat, and feldspar jumped aboard through the companionway. Through the rail in the rail in the boat to greet Ned. I called feldspar to have him come back to the Zodiac, whereupon he took off down the companionway of the sailboat, seemingly thinking that he could get back to the Zodiac through a tunnel from below decks of the sailboat that he had somehow missed during the winter. If you think of this island as a sailboat that doesn't move, you will understand that you still have to need all the needs as with the sailboat to be constantly fixing things and deal with the ocean. You are now approaching having an understanding of what the challenges are. At least you do not have to worry about the island sinking or sailing the island, and not about having the island sink, not to be confused with worrying about sea level rising. So you are at least ahead of the game here. Involuntarily tracking the weather conditions and the sea state become an integral part of your daily routine. My partner Betsy, who grew up in Manchester, she's the projectionist here. I'll talk about why I need a projectionist in a little while. And Betsy and I recently visited relatives for a weekend at their home on the shore of Lake Winnipesaukee. Each of us became somewhat disoriented because the tide never went in and it never went out. And it was very disconcerting and very unfamiliar. On the island, we were unconsciously tracking the nights and the tides and the days without even thinking about it. The effects of weather events, even such as significant summer squalls and northeasters, have very little impact on our lives on the island. There are no electrical wires to speak of to be worried about. When I was perhaps in the 7th grade, I remember playing for the greater duration of a hurricane outside. The wind got to perhaps 80 miles an hour or more. And we just went over the backside of the island, and when the wind was out of the east, opened our raincoats up and get blown into the bushes over and over and over. Normally, and fortunately, accessibility has not been at issue during various medical emergencies. Oh, wait a minute, I think I skipped a page. I'm sorry. Skipped a page. Some storms are much stronger than the ones I was talking about and require much more respect and cause much more damage, as Hurricane Carol did when I was about 6. This is a picture of the damage it did in one on the backside of the island. The picture in the upper left had a porch all the way around it. The picture on the upper right, you see it lost a portion of its main roof, but it also had a porch all the way around this side and another porch on top of the porch on the right-hand side that was taken off, and the other side looked the same. And the cottage on the lower left is right near that. Those 3 cottages left are very near each other on the backside of the island. And the cottage on the upper right, many of those porches have not been replaced even at this time. And then the next slide is the picture of our ferry after Hurricane Carol. And that ferry didn't run anymore. And the next picture is just a picture I threw in here. This is a picture that we found looking for something else for this lecture. We were looking for a picture of the Indian, the sailboat that's behind it. And this picture was from the 1930s, early 1930s, in Marblehead Harbor. And this boat in the 70s was a ferry from Marblehead to Baker's Island. That's why I put it in there. The no-name storm of 1991 nearly washed out our pier. For several tide cycles, which were each perhaps 6 to 8 feet above normal, the tide never went out. Next slide. And at some times, the waves were actually over the deck of the pier at the height of the storm. And this is a picture of the cottage on the backside of the island in the middle of the no-name storm. My ex-sister-in-law calls the backside of the island the rear end of the island. But after the no-name storm, I found baseball-sized rocks on the upper roof of this cottage. A friend of mine and fellow islander had been on Baker's Island for the Hurricane of '38 and the Hurricane Carol, and he was also on the island during the no-name storm. He told me that being there, he was petrified, while not knowing what he should be petrified of being there. He was in his cottage, which was nowhere near the water, nowhere near the shore. The dishes in his cabinets were rattling from the waves hitting the backside of the island, being seismically transported to the cabinets in his house. He estimated every wave to have been well over 50 feet high for over 24 hours. At times like these, the island is inaccessible. Normally, inaccessibility is something that we like. It's a positive. But fortunately, accessibility has not been an issue during various medical emergencies. As I stand here in front of you tonight, I can say that I have had a mild heart attack while on Baker's Island. I rowed out to our boat, got it on the mooring, and came back into Manchester to go to hospital. I am the only living islander who has been involved with both transporting a major stroke victim off the island and also has been a major stroke victim being transported to hospital from the island. When at the end of the pier on Baker's Island, my stroke left me paralyzed on my right side, unable to speak, and resulted in the loss of my right side of my vision from here to there. That was 3 years ago. It was getting dark, it was stormy, it was an extra high tide, and the waves were breaking 2 feet over the highest landing. As a result of swift action by Betsy in coordination with various islanders in the Salem Harbor Master's crew, I thankfully got to Salem Hospital quickly enough to get the TPA treatment that allowed for my substantial recovery. That's one of the reasons why I need a projectionist, because it's become more difficult for me to keep certain ducks in a row. And some of these slides come pretty fast in various parts of this. And I thank Betsy for taking on that challenge. Almost everyone on Baker's Island has tested the island's accessibility at one time or another. Everyone has a story or two, or perhaps too many stories, of having been out on the waters when they probably shouldn't have been out there. Be it fog, wind, waves, boat problems, or several or all of these at the same time. As Sturgis Crocker from Manchester used to say, if you have a boat, you have a problem. I do have an accessibility story that also has a feldspar component to it. As usual, these stories have a component of some dire need to either get or on or off the island. When anyone recalls such a story, they normally cannot recall any of the exact details of why they needed to get to do that, but this is one of those stories. Suffice it to say that I needed to get to the island on that day. Although it was windy, the wind was forecast by NOAA and others to increase significantly, perhaps to as much as 50 miles an hour. So I left Manchester Harbor in the morning into a stiff southwesterly breeze with a full cargo that included an upright vacuum cleaner, which actually was packed upright in the boat. I'm sure that my dire need to get to the island did not include vacuuming. Halfway across the channel, feldspar began barking furiously and growling, neither of which he did. And he was looking toward the stern of the boat, and as I turned to see what was going on, I heard the unmistakable engine noise of the Coast Guard 47-foot crash boat. And they wanted to know where I was headed, although the vacuum cleaner should have told them. And they asked to see my life jacket. Feldspar, of course, had his life jacket on. I dug mine out of the bow bag and showed it to them. They shook their heads and they were off. A friend who had witnessed that exchange with the Coast Guard helped me with my gear at the pier. But the best part of this story is that when I got my gear up to the cottage, the gray stars parted and the wind died to zero. The wind stayed calm for the next 2 hours or so. I called NOAA in Taunton to ask where the predicted wind was. I was referred to a very nice man at NOAA who used to live in Marblehead, who assured me that it was blowing 55 miles an hour over my head, 4,000 feet over my head. That gentleman's name was Tom Fair, and during our conversation over the next 45 minutes or so, he assured me that every once in a while their forecasts just suck. Everyone has a fog story. One thing about fog stories is it's hard to give you a picture of them because it's foggy. Some are either as dramatic as having left Baker's Island in a fog and having run up on the sands of West Beach full throttle while somehow missing the rocks of Misery Island, or leaving the island and running up against an 800-foot tanker coming into the channel and not being in front of it, having been in front of it. Others are more comical, such as one trip that I had, again with my dog, Feldspar, sorry to say. For various reasons, I did not have my compass fixed to my 13-foot inflatable. Feldspar was agitated by our slow progress in the fog because he knew how long the trip should take, and it was not taking too long. He kept kicking the compass around the floor of the boat. We ended up firstly outside of Whaleback, then inside of Solly Rocks, and then lastly on the Manchester shore long toward West Beach. Now, I apologize to people who don't know the harbor, but the compass directions to go from point A to B in those stories don't get you to Manchester Harbor. when I told a friend of mine that I wish I had a plot of That Wayward Trip, his response was to chuckle and to comment that he thought it was entirely possible that given his past experiences with solid rocks, he would not be totally surprised if in future they became a precipitating factor in his death. One time when I was trying to get out to the island, I called a friend, and because it was foggy and she had just bought a new compass, she said she wouldn't come in, and she hadn't calibrated it yet, she wouldn't come in and pick me up. I then called another friend of mine who said, "That's great. I just bought a new compass and I haven't calibrated it yet, so I'll come and pick you up because I want to know how far it's off." You just can't make this stuff up. Moving on to my childhood on the island in the 50s and 60s, I relate this anecdote, which also requires the theme of fog as an essential component. There was no television on the island at that time. Indeed, there was no electricity on the island at that time except for the light station. The light station manned by the Coast Guard personnel did have electricity, and they did have a TV. We children would go up to the light as guests of the keepers to watch television. The keepers' wives would make us popcorn sometimes, and it was great fun. We were later to understand that one of the keepers' wives was using the same pot to make the popcorn in as she was using to boil her baby's diapers, but it didn't really matter, and that didn't bother us too much. One very, very foggy night, as four of us were up there watching TV, the two keepers were filling our heads with a story about the old man that used to live on Misery, the fog man, who would row over from Baker's Island only on foggy nights and peek into cottage windows. They said that he never heard anyone that they knew of. He just lurked about. Perhaps he tried to catch a young child a couple of times, but they didn't think he had ever been successful. So as you were guessing, as we were leaving the keeper's house, his wife delayed us slightly, just long enough for the both keepers covered with sheets to gain their positions in the thick fog behind a cottage ahead of us on the route to our home. When they sprang out, we of course cried out and scattered most appropriately, one of our group, by rolling up in a ball and rolling into the bushes. The next day, reinforced by the light and the lack of fog, we assured that member of our group that he'd overreacted. Many days were filled with our favorite game. It was playing Relivio. Basically, it was hide and seek. There were two teams of, say, 5 on each team. The object was for one team of 5 to hide, and the other team's task was to catch them, put them in jail. Catching required more than seeing the other team member. You had to touch them. The game ended when everyone on the other team was in jail. The real problem for the jailers was that if a member that was still outstanding of the team that was hiding got into the jail, all the people were released again. These games might last for a week. The course was either half the island or the whole island, but not on the rocks. Programmed intermissions were called at meal times. But I remember one particular game in which one member of the other team was outstanding for a few days, only to release all his members at the end of that time. So we started a new game. Swimming, boating, sailing were, of course, popular pastimes. There was one sailboat in particular. Well, one of the reasons that this sailboat is depicted here is Baker's Island was the captain of the black sailboat at the time. There was one sailboat in particular that played a role in 2 near-death experiences for me. These pictures have gotten in here sort of out of order a little bit, but we're just going to show them to you here. We can go back to them if we have to. These are various events, island events that happen, including curling on the pond, swirling as they were calling it. And that was fairly recently, 2 caretakers ago. So next slide, I guess. So there was one sailboat that tried to kill me a couple of times, and it was a sailboat that was just like this. It was an Indian. An Indian is like a Manchester 15, except it's 21 feet long. The Indian was designed by Sam Crocker when he worked from Manchester when he worked for Alden Boats. So we could borrow this boat, and it was fast, seaworthy and fast, and of course we tried to get the most out of it. But the owner of the boat had tried to make it even faster, and he put extra lead ballast under the floorboards on the sides of the lapstrake joints, and in order to make it stiffer to the wind. And we were having a gay old time. The 4 of us who were at the up at the lighthouse, same crew, and we were 5 miles off Baker's Island to the east on a broad reach heading straight for Provincetown. The wind was out of the west at perhaps 30 miles an hour. We were heeled over such that was green water. This is not an Indian, but this is where I was with this guy in the white. I didn't have my feet inside, but the water was right up to the coaming there. And the lead shifted. And green water was 2 feet over my head. The boat swamped in an instant. Everybody did what they were supposed to do, let go of the sheet, the tiller, and we came upwind. But we were half full of water. And if we had filled with water, we would have sunk. There wasn't a boat in sight for miles. All of our life jackets were stowed up in the bow. So we bailed with whatever we had, T-shirts and 1 bailer, and we just about got a third of the water out when we shipped the green water right over the bow, and we were back in the same condition. So we started to sail into the wind, off the wind a little, and bailed and trailing water over the rear after deck of the boat, like there was this much water going over the after deck while we were sailing. It's a good thing that water came out, so obviously we made it. My other near-death experience with that Indian began innocuously enough. The sailboat broke from its mooring in a southwesterly wind and was being held from going underneath the pier by the mast, banging against the pier. I was 16 years old. I was selected to row out to the sailboat with another person who was much stronger than myself in a dinghy, 1 on each oar. And we rowed to get it out to pass it off to a powerboat. And the powerboat had begun to tow it, and the other person who was in the dinghy with me decided to catch a ride and grabbed onto the tow line, which we immediately swamped. And the sailboat was approaching and was underway from the tow, and I pushed to try to get down below the sailboat, but I didn't make it, I guess, because I didn't come up for 4 or 5 minutes. The people on the pier were kind of panicky, and I must have hit my head, and I was conscious when I surfaced, and I'd swallowed some water, but again, I'm here. I'm going to pause here because these stories are just samples. These stories happen every week, these kind of stories. People on the island, even if they don't have sailboats, everybody by the time they're 20 years old has been involved with multiple rescues or saving boats or whatever. And I'm sorry if I'm boring you, but this is one that I think is really interesting. One very calm summer night when I was a teenager, a few of us were bouncing on a trampoline on the east side of the island. And we were thinking that we thought we heard cries for help, but there were no boats around. It was a warm summer night. There was no wind. And we finally resolved to do something about it. We informed the lighthouse keepers of our concerns. Basically, we couldn't tell them anything, and they decided that our information was insufficient for them to take action. We determined to check the cries out, and we convinced one of our group's mothers to let us go and investigate in their 21-foot boat. Night was falling when we found the source of distress. Some 4 or 5 men were fishing in a lobster-type boat, and they were getting ready to leave. They were fishing for the day. They discovered that the gas line had parted and the bilge of the boat was full of gasoline, so they didn't dare to start the boat. So they'd been calling for help for many hours. They were 3.5 miles off the backside of Acres, and it was really lucky that we had heard them. We took them in tow with the intention of taking them to the Baker's Island dock. By now it was totally dark. The coast, no moon, no light. The Coast Guard, hearing that we were going to look for someone, had decided to scramble a helicopter to investigate. We were running without running lights as we were towing a bomb, and we needed to see because we didn't get fouled with a lobster pot and have the boat that was much heavier than us run us down full of gasoline. The Coast Guard finally found us, and when they did, they immediately blinded us with their searchlights, which we responded to as 18-year-olds are apt to do in a universally recognized display of displeasure. We landed the tow at the pier. They did turn the light off. We landed the tow at the pier, and the Coast Guard arrived presently and towed it away. When I was 16 years old, a Coast Guard lightkeeper, this picture is taken from the top of the lighthouse, and there's the upper keeper's house and the lower keeper's house, and the cottage directly in the middle is my cottage. There's the reason this picture is there is because there's the Coast Guard Jeep. That's the first vehicle I drove with a standard shift. The Coast Guard keeper gave me my first lesson in in driving. I was helping him throw stuff over the Coast Guard dump when he said to me, "Get behind the wheel." The Jeep was backed up to the edge of the sloping bank, and it would have been very easy to fail to negotiate the start and have the Jeep wind up in the dump. Think of the number of vehicles that wound up in the water at the Manchester boat ramp, and you have about the same picture. Presumably, the number of mishaps at the Manchester boat launching ramp have nothing to do with somebody just starting to learn to drive. The keeper explained everything to me. Heel and toe, release the parking brake, which of course didn't work very well. He further stated that he'd be sitting shotgun seat if anything should go awry. I put it into first. I started up with the clutch in and released the parking brake. As we started to roll back a few feet, I let out the clutch. Of course, the Jeep immediately stalled and we started to roll back. The keeper stomped his left foot on top of my foot on the brake pedal and said, "Try again." This time we lurched and bucked forward, as you can imagine, and we were off clean as a whistle, exercising my newfound sense of bravado. Before I was 10 years old, and usually toward the end of every season, the people of the island would have an island clam bake. And these events were very transformative for me. They were male bondings, even though you see a lot of women here now. Oh, and this child here with the sailor's hat on in the front here, that's Bruce Collins right there. This part of the event that's pictured here is only the second part. The first part was the night before. And mostly men only would sit on the beach, gather seaweed, and sit around the fire and talk and drink whiskey. And I just thought that was great. They didn't let me drink, but public drinking was not very common at that time on the island. So when I became older, those clam bakes faded away and stopped happening. I missed them. So in my 30s, I decided to start hosting large late season parties for well over 100. My idea was to provide a theme for a party menu that was a challenging one and no one in attendance had tried before, including myself. Then those in attendance had to come together to try to make it happen. I would get the whole thing rolling, sometimes watching from a neighboring cottage porch, see how it's going. Then I would jump in and start helping as directed as fit. Some of the menus for these parties were clam bakes with lobsters and clams and corn and chicken layered and those were 60-pound and a quarter lobsters right there. And that's my nephew, my sister's son, Duncan. And we did 2 stuffed grilled lambs that you saw with avogalamono soup, Texas chili, Sunday brunch complete with waffles, bacon, sausages, ham, pancakes, designer omelets, fried eggs, poached eggs, all cooked over an open fire. Of course, with coffee and mimosas. And my favorite party menu, though, was a baked stuffed halibut. The fish was in 3 pieces of fish. The largest halibut was half of the total weight of 57 pounds of halibut. Just as the stuffed halibut came off the fire, a fierce squall hit with winds of 65 miles an hour and 2 inches of rain. We just moved around to the other side of the porch. And the following day, we made a fabulous Manhattan chowder for 50 or so. Baker's Island events during the season are a non-denominational church service held each Sunday at the hall. Have included a golf tournament, bonfire, field day, potluck dinners, a croquet tournament. That's a field day, my nephew, 2-fisted watermelon. A long-running gong show, a pancake breakfast, a sunrise service at the season's end. The black dog in this picture is at field day. That's the North End's coach for the tug of war. That's Betsy's dog, Ella. You want to go back and show them Ella? And that's Ella. That was the only picture we have of Ella. But anyway, several years ago, the Island Association celebrated its 100th anniversary of its organization. Betsy and I, with the help of several friends, made the cake for the celebration. Of course, the late, great Mr. Lysiak from Manchester and his crew catered the anniversary dinner. The cake was a butter frosting, yellow cake, layer cake. The recipe was my mother's recipe for my birthday cakes. And the cake was 4 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, in the shape of the island, complete with the lighthouse and cupcakes for all of the cottages. Some of them had the appropriate frosting colored for their roofs. Work parties maintain the community buildings and the pier. The Bakers Island Wharf Company maintains a store for its members' convenience during the summer high season. I am currently a member of the board of directors of the Bakers Island Wharf Company and have been its past president for a term before term limits that seem to last approximately for decades. I have done tons of research on Bakers Island and have been working on for several years on a history of the island as it relates to those who have been associated with it. This work is more like a selective history of northeastern North America since 1550. We hold fire drills to learn and relearn the proper use of our firefighting apparatus. For one fire drill I hosted, with the help of friends, cooked sausage and pepper sandwiches for 150, complete with an upscale strawberry shortcake, a la the Russian Tea Room, New York, New York, for dessert. Upscale is the code word for French orange brandy, of course. Several islanders who were in their late 70s or 80s claimed it was the best strawberry shortcake they ever had. Many of those insisted upon taking a second or third home. Many families have been on the island for generations. This is a picture of our cottage. The horse's name was Rocket. The man is Captain Hadley, who was the lightkeeper in either 1917 or 1918. And the Horton or Nicholson cottage was built in 1911, the same year as ours. Ours was built. And my dear Anna Horton Nicholson remembered this cottage, the woman pictured there, and her husband, Lowell, remembered her cottage when it had been just built when she was 7 years old and the grass was still green underneath the cottage. We bought our cottage, which we had been renting for 6 or 7 years, from the daughter of the builders, thus becoming only the second family to own it. We bought our cottage in 1964 or 65 from the daughter of the people who built it in 1911. And unbeknownst to us, that woman died in 2008. She lived to be 108. I've had the great good fortune of having extremely close friends in each of 4 generations of the Nicholson and Horton families. That's my friend Ruth, which was one of Anna's 4 daughters. That's Ruth's son, Horton, and his cousin when they were children. And that's Ruth and Horton's daughter, Roxy. So Roxy would be Anna's great-granddaughter. Roxy considers Bakers Island her home, although she's only spends maybe 3 or 4 weeks a year at the island. Phyllis Collins, the wife of my family friends, kept the jar filled with my favorite sandwich cookies for me at her cottage at least 20 years after I'd graduated from college. Phyllis was married, my ex-girlfriends, my ex-wife, my ex-wife's boyfriends, ex-boyfriends lived nearby, ex-cousins, ex-brothers-in-law, as sisters-in-law and ex-nieces and ex-nephews do as well. Where else are you aware of a place where these type of relationships have been thrust into proximity with each other? Speaking of another type of relationship, there are 4 geologists on Baker's Island as we speak, owners of cottages on the island. I am one. The cottage to the west of mine is owned by another one. The cottage to the west of that one is owned by a friend whose daughter and son-in-law are both geologists. The geologist, whose name is Beverly, was so named in that her grandparents had a cottage on Baker's Island. When Beverly was working on her PhD work in Namibia, West Africa, getting her PhD in geology, she ran across a bivalve fossil that was such and such fossil Beverlyensis, because that fossil had been first identified in Beverly, Massachusetts. So, again, I'm forced to say that you can't make this stuff up. Islanders do fall in love with other islanders and get married. I count 12 of those marriages during my lifetime, but who's counting? At least 4 of those marriages occurred on the island. The weddings occurred on the island. My marriage was one of the 12 marriages and one of the 4 that were held on the island. When I married my second wife, Pamela, that's Pamela leaving for her honeymoon. She was one of the daughters of an island family. The following relationships became applicable to my marriage. Pay close attention here, as there'll be a quiz later. And I will not be repeating anything. My best friend was a little older than myself. Pamela's aunt, who was also a year older than myself, was my best friend's stepmother. She had 2 sons with my best friend's father, those sons being my best friend's half-brothers. Those half-sons became half-uncles to my best friend's children, even though as uncles they were younger than their half-niece and half-nephew. Okay, so you might be able to follow that so far, but brace yourself. Pamela's brother, my new brother-in-law, was married to my next-door neighbor's uncle's stepdaughter, who was one of twins. And they had 2 daughters. Nieces to me, that's pretty easy, right? Okay. Takes a long time even to write this stuff down. Pamela's brothers and my new brother-in-law's wife's twin brother, who also was my next-door neighbor's uncle's stepson, also married an islander's daughter, and they had 2 children. So those are second nieces to me, I guess. This is not the end, and it gets even more difficult, so double down. My next-door neighbor's uncle secondly married an islander's family's daughter and adopted her son, who was also the progeny of another inter-island marriage, who had held the given first name, which was the same as my neighbor's last name. So, and I'll try to make it easy for you, I swear. So my brother-in-law had a step-half brother-in-law whose given name and last name are the same. Question, this is the question. What was my relationship to my brother-in-law's step-half brother-in-law? And there's a hint here. It's a trick question. I have been divorced from Pamela for 10 years, and this is the first time I've ever even posited this question. Despite what you may think, there are many people on the island that are not related to anyone else on the island. Almost everyone works together, and most people have a common stock of material parts and pieces that could become useful later. That stock is a communal one. If you can find something in their stuff, your neighbor says, take it. A lot of fixes are very imaginative. Fixing and repairing things are never-ending tasks. Nearly every conversation on Baker's Island, during daylight anyway, ends when someone says, well, it's time to get back to work. The tractor of choice on Baker's Island is a 20-year-old, this is an aside here. This is Pamela and Feldspar riding and my ex-father-in-law. I think that was on an easy-go golf cart, which almost never ran. The only way you could keep it going was every 20 minutes or 40 minutes, or if you were lucky, 4 hours. You had to take the carburetor off and take it all apart and clean it out. I got so I could do that in 10 minutes. Take it out and put it back in. And that's what you had to do. The tractor of choice. There's an example of the tractor of choice. It's a 20 to 30-year-old wheel horse, and they are too numerous to count. We bought a new one, 1986 or 97, 1986 or 1987, just this past summer. I've been on the island overnight at least once in every month of the year. In all but two of the months of the year, those nights have been in my own cottage. As a carpenter, I've worked on about 35 of the cottages or community buildings on the island. I built an addition to a cottage in the months of June when the average condition was pouring down rain with wind. We poured the footings after we had made the deck of the addition propped up on wheelbarrows and such, because the day we poured the footings was the first day since we dug the footings that it was the ground under the addition was not a pond. The following day, it rained hard. We stood up the frame of the southeast wall in a gale of rain and wind. No one need to hold the plywood against the wall. You just put it up there and it stayed there. We just put the frame in and put the plywood against the frame, and the wind held it up, and there was no rush to nail it off. Following that, we continued in the work in the rain shadow of that wall. A friend of mine who was working on someone's cottage doing footings, perhaps in that same year, I'm not sure. The customer was anticipating getting to the island and contacted my friend to see how the work was going. My friend responded to my customer, "Good, it's only rained once." The statement was true in that it only rained once, but for 30 days. After a night in November when the wind had gusted 10 or 12 times an hour from a steady 35 miles an hour to gusts of 80 miles an hour with no wind speed in between, the wind had shifted to the west and blew 55 miles an hour all day. That same friend was seen washing his windows on his west-facing porch windows during when the wind was blowing 55 miles an hour. Baker's Islanders have traditionally kept their ears to the ground about initiatives ashore that could have major impacts to our best interests. This only makes sense, especially if you understand the following. During my lifetime, Baker's Island has been actively considered to become either used for one of the following uses or has been proposed to have been included in these studies in order: an oil terminal, a nuclear power plant, a sewage treatment plant, an LNG terminal, to have become the legally required replacement state conservation land if certain state Massachusetts conservation land were taken out of conservation land for use as an LNG terminal, to have been included in the boundary study of a newly created movement toward a Boston Harbor Islands North recreation area, to have been included in the area of a proposed federal boundary study in the interest of expanding the boundary of the Salem Maritime National Historic Site. One other use that was proposed earlier in the 20th century, well before my time, was a state mental hospital, which was ultimately built in Norfolk, Mass, and is now closed. Also before my time, the North Shore Babies Hospital was founded on Baker's Island in 1904 after an outbreak of cholera infantum in Peabody. It's hard to envision any other place consisting of 55 acres that have been actively considered for each of these uses. Being alone and being the only person on the island is a very different feeling than being just among a few people on the island. I have been that person several times in my life, and I cannot truly say how I feel about it or how I could describe it. But it's something akin to, it's different, but it's something akin to Linda Greenlaw's answer when somebody asked if she could tell the difference between a 40-foot wave and a 50-foot wave. And I paraphrase without leaving the slang language. No, but a 40-foot wave is bad, and a 50-foot wave is really bad. There's a heightened sense of exhilaration and responsibility for self and for the island being the only person around. Rachel Field's poem, If You Have Once Slept on an Island, written in 1920, expresses some of these feelings of having grew up on the island. If you have once slept on an island, you will never be quite the same. You may look as you did the day before, and you may go by the same old name. You may bustle about in street and shop. You may sit at home and sew, but you'll see blue water and wheeling gulls wherever your feet may go. You may chat with your neighbors of this and that, and close to your fire keep, but you'll hear ship whistle and lighthouse bell, and tides beat through your sleep. Oh, you won't know why, and you can't say how. Such a change upon you came, but once you have slept on an island, you'll never be quite the same. And if anybody wants to tell me what the answer to the quiz is, I'll tell you what the answer is. If nobody wants to venture a guess. The answer is none. I'm not married to Pamela anymore. I'll be happy to respond to your questions now, but first I would give you the answer to one of the first questions I anticipate someone in the audience might ask before I start. The answer to that question is they're not. So, questions?
I will have time for maybe 2 questions. Austin? Only because you've got a beer.
I don't want to be offensive in any way, but why is the island so exclusionary? I mean,
The island is private property.
yes, but I mean, we're allowed to visit other places that are private property.
By
You're
invitation.
enormously from visiting Baker's Island.
It's private property. If you're not invited, people don't invite you in your backyard, do they? People don't show up in your backyard.
True. But
It's the same thing.
it seems somewhat more paranoid than that.
I disagree.
Chris?
Do you rely on the city of Salem for any services? I know you don't have electricity, you don't have water, you don't have sewer, but do you rely on
The only
city?
trash and police protection when we need it. Fire protection, perhaps.
Harbor master.
We don't have harbor master services. Harbor master's job ends at the high water mark. That's his job description.
So do you pay taxes to the town?
We definitely do, yeah. Yeah. I should say that that's what we get. We get trash. We get police protection, fire protection if they could get there, and the harbor master.
It comes in Salem or Beverly?
Well, both. The island is, the waters of the island are largely Beverly waters. The Salem waters, although Salem is in Beverly, I mean, Baker's Island is in Salem, the land. The waters around it, almost to the south end of the island, are Beverly waters. And then,
Hope the waters know this.
well, they do, and they have agreements between each other to help each other out.